Welcome to this session of the Ancestral Healing Summit. I'm Lisa Bonnice, your host, and my guest for this session is Dr. Linda Backman. Our topic today is When Interplanetary Past Life Karma Unravels Earth-Based Ancestral Trauma. Dr. Linda Backman is a psychologist and soul regression therapist who's been in practice for over 40 years, 25 years of those as a regression therapist. She's the author of 3 books, including her most recent one, Souls on Earth. Linda, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. I always enjoy our time together.
Lisa, I always enjoy it. It's an honor and a pleasure to be back with you.
Yeah, I can't wait to dive in because our topic today is it's a bit of a mind bender. Once again, it's when interplanetary past life karma unravels Earth-based ancestral trauma. So let's go ahead and start with just some foundational information. Let's start first with what is an interplanetary soul?
Okay, good. Yeah, even Lisa, as the title was sort of coming to me and coming to you, it's like, okay, is anyone even going to understand just looking at those words? Okay, so an interplanetary soul is a soul that most of the time does not incarnate on Earth, and that interplanetary soul, we might say, originates from a place, an energy, a location in the celestial realm that isn't technically tied to the energy of Earth.
All right. Pin number 1. So on the flip side, with our topic within this framework, how do you view Earth-based ancestral trauma?
Well, okay. I mean, Earth-based, that's probably obvious to the listener. Earth-based means there was trauma that happened. And, when we talk about ancestral, and this might be a slight tweak in a way to how some people talk about ancestors, we obviously have, Lisa has blood ancestors, Linda has blood ancestors. And so we think about our bloodline. But we also have ancestral trauma that comes from past lives. We have souls that we've known in past lives that we could call ancestors that may or may not be part of our blood family today, but actually could be our best friend, our favorite mentor, a teacher, a neighbor. So that's the tricky part about, we're kind of stretching the terminology here and stretching the mind. Yeah.
Do all souls have interplanetary past lives, or is that a select few? What do the numbers look like, the percentages?
Yeah. So maybe I'll go, back. This might help people. Just for a second, Lisa, I'll go back to the notion of people might say, well, okay, when intelligent life began on Earth, when souls began to incarnate on Earth, where did those souls come from? So we can start there, because I think maybe that's a kind of a beginning foundational perspective. The souls that came to Earth originally to embody on Earth came from somewhere else. They came from somewhere else in the celestial realm before Earth existed. So technically speaking, all of us on Earth were once interplanetary. But in a way, that's not exactly what I'm going to talk about today. I'm talking about people on Earth who are obviously embodied souls and interplanetary souls. See, even I have, it's like trying to make this obvious and clear. There are people on Earth, embodied souls, who primarily do not incarnate on Earth. And that's because their souls come from somewhere other than the frequency of Earth in the spiritual realm. So I hope that makes sense.
Right. So the word interplanetary doesn't necessarily mean that they came from Jupiter or planets unknown to us at this point. It could be interdimensional.
Right, exactly. That's a great question too. So when I use the term interplanetary, now some people use the term starseed, which is another term when people might say, well, I came from somewhere else, I'm a star seed. But what I mean when I say interplanetary, what I'm referring to is a soul. Actually, as souls, let me put it this way, souls have a home base. If you're what I call an earth-based soul, that means you primarily incarnate on earth. Your home base, or where your higher self resides, is a frequency tied to earth. But if you're an interplanetary soul, where your soul resides, and if you're in body, you have a higher self when you're in body on earth, your soul's home base is a planet, a star system, interdimensional space. And then the logical question that sort of comes out of that is, well, where? Do we mean Arcturus? Do we mean the Pleiades? Do we mean Orion's belt? Well, we mean basically anywhere. And many of the locations where interplanetary or IP souls come from are not locations whose name would even have meaning to us. But yes, planets, star systems, and also interdimensional space.
Okay, so just for shorthand, we're using the word interplanetary, but that means all of the above what we've just mentioned. So just wanted to
Right.
set some foundation down. So with that explained, interplanetary souls can come to Earth with other interplanetary souls, and so therefore we can have past lives with other interplanetary souls. Is that accurate?
Yeah, here's where it gets a little bit complicated and messy as I thought about, what we were going to chat about today. So, okay, we can have past lives if we're an interplanetary soul, and I'm sure people are sitting there wondering, so how would I know if I'm an interplanetary soul? And so just hang, calm, and everybody listening, and we'll get to that. But on Earth today, we can know someone, sometimes a blood family member, and we can look at it that way if that's simpler for people. But on Earth today, we can know someone with whom we had a past life that was not on Earth, but was interplanetary.
If one is an interplanetary soul, where does the bigger part of the soul? First of all, you've explained in the past that what's here in our physical body is just a small slice of the bigness that what we are, of what we actually are. So if we're an interplanetary soul and that small slice of soul is embodying and animating our human suit, where does the rest of us reside?
Yeah, great question. So that's our higher self. That's that term that most of us have a pretty agreed upon explanation for, higher self, our soul self. So you might say when we come into body on earth, we bring a slice, like a slice of pie, of our soul energy. The remainder of our soul is our higher self that resides, if we're IP, if we're interplanetary, resides at our soul's home base in the celestial realm.
So if you're an earth-based soul, where does your higher self reside?
As am I, so I can easily respond to that question. My higher self, the Linda higher self, which of course isn't named Linda, resides at a frequency tied to Earth. Sometimes people use the term a spiritual realm or heaven. So think about, everybody listening, think about there is a place called the spiritual realm that is the energetic frequency tied to Earth. That's where my higher self resides.
Okay. All right. So now, why would an interplanetary soul even want to come to Earth? Because from my understanding, this is a pretty hard place to be. And in all the galactic isness, I've heard it said that Earth is it's a challenging place. Why would an interplanetary soul even want to come here?
Great question. So Let me first say that an interplanetary soul would not come here if they hadn't agreed to come here. So I want people to hear that loud and clear. Nobody just kind of twists both of your interplanetary arms, if you had arms, and says you have to go. But some of these explanations are simple, and this one is simple. The only reason that an interplanetary soul comes to Earth is because that interplanetary soul, those interplanetary souls, certainly more than one on Earth, that interplanetary soul is highly evolved and comes from an evolved location in the spiritual realm, and Earth is in, I would say, almost dire need, if I can use that word, of evolution. So we need the wisdom of interplanetary souls on Earth.
Okay. All right. Then, so interplanetary souls are slightly different from Earth-based souls. Do all souls on Earth have karma?
Basically, yes. Some more, some less. But basically, if we, however to put that, in body on Earth, we still have, we might say, cleanup work to do. We might have some new learning, relearning, cleanup work of some degree of karma.
Okay. All right. So we keep digging a little further. So with all of this said, how can we begin to, I guess, uncover an interplanetary past life that helps to, I guess, unravel challenged relationships with someone that we know here in our human lives today?
Yes, and I thought, obviously, before we started our talk today, Lisa, I thought, how do we, just like you, how do we build on steps here today to help understand this? So maybe, if I may, let's go to the quick foundation of, if someone is listening, or you're listening and you know someone, how might you know that you or someone you know is an interplanetary soul? Because I think that'll help make this a little bit simpler, which it's not a simple topic, but and I'll get to the point of explaining how did I learn this, because that might be important. So what makes Linda think she understands this? So bottom line, if someone is an interplanetary soul, number one, they are, we might say, the words are always hard, evolved, have wisdom. If you're an interplanetary soul, probably you're unique in some way. And by unique, I mean, you have a broader perspective of life. Now, you might not go around saying, oh, well, I have a broader perspective of life. But if you're an interplanetary soul, you understand healthy values, healthy way of life, healthy relationships, and you bring that wisdom. Now, you also might have highly unique wisdom. You might have technological wisdom. You might have music-based wisdom or artistic-based wisdom. Interplanetary souls always have, we might say, advanced skills because of where they come from. So if you're IP, you see the world, you might look upon humanity, the world meaning humanity, and say, well, why does that person treat that other person that way? Or why don't they understand? I mean, you might not verbalize this, but you would feel it perhaps inside. So interplanetary souls always are evolved. We could put it that way. But the flip side is, to know you're an interplanetary soul, interplanetary souls tend to have challenges as well. They might have learning challenges. They might have, and I've talked about this before, so some of the listeners may have heard this. They might have allergy challenges, autoimmune disorder challenges, autistic spectrum challenges, physical challenges. Why? And you used the term a few minutes ago, Lisa, you talked about this suit that we wear, because as a soul, yes, Lisa wears her human suit, Linda wears her human suit. It's harder for an interplanetary soul to reside and operate in this suit because it's unfamiliar. So people, if you're wondering, am I an interplanetary soul? Then look for your own wisdom, but also look for your physical, emotional challenges.
Okay. So this brings up another question entirely, because one of the biggest concepts of ancestral healing is that many times we do inherit physical challenges, illnesses, whatever, from our DNA ancestors, the human suits that came before us and reproduced, and we came from the sperm and the egg, and that's what caused our DNA to express in a certain way with certain physical challenges. So is there a difference between what you were talking about, how interplanetary souls sometimes have difficulty interacting with the earth plane, and these actual physical inherited DNA based illnesses?
Probably, if someone is dealing with inherited some physiological or psychological, because those can be inherited too. If you're dealing with heritable genetic background issues, that doesn't necessarily say anything about earth-based versus interplanetary. Although, so you might say, well, my mother suffered, so I have trouble with migraines, let's just say. My mother suffered from migraines, and that's not true of Linda, but just to use that as an example, yes, that could say you inherited that propensity to migraines. But, or maybe better said, and if you've had past lives with your mother, and your mother happens to be interplanetary and you're interplanetary, then you might just say all bets are off, because it might be coming from your soul ancestral line as much as your blood ancestral line.
Okay, so it sounds like you got a bit of a double whammy there. How do you even start to work on healing something that is so complex?
Well, yes, I think the big question, and either my guides are talking to me, Lisa, or I'm able to get hunches about what are people wondering. So, okay, let me say this in terms of helping the listeners. So, everybody, as you're listening to this discussion, think about, is there someone in your life with whom you've always had a challenging relationship? And as best you can figure, that challenging relationship does not just come from current life. So, like, you can't, and this is where trust has to come in. Like, everybody, trust your hunches, because I'm sure everyone knows our hunches are often based on intuition. So if there's someone in your life, and no matter how hard you try, the relationship is just complicated. And if, just to try to get this to make sense, and if you think you might be an interplanetary soul, then you might have an interplanetary past life with that person. Let's just make it simple. Let's say it's your sibling. And no matter how hard you try, and you don't totally understand it, you just have conflict with a sibling. And you think that you're an interplanetary soul. And then, now, listeners, you know a little bit about the signs and indications of being an interplanetary soul, and you don't get along with your sibling, who you also suspect might be an interplanetary soul, then you may be dealing with interplanetary past life karma that shows up in human current life.
Okay. All right. So bringing this back into the ancestral realm, if we're talking about a sibling, you have the same ancestors, you have the same parents, grandparents, etc.
Mhm.
If we're working on healing the scenario that you just described, what would be our first place to look? Would it be doing perhaps a past life regression or an ancestral healing session? Where would you begin
Mm.
if somebody came to you with this question?
Well, because of my orientation and the work I've done for about 28 years guiding regression. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm in my mind, which I'll share in a few minutes. I'm thinking about a couple of recent clients that I worked with, but I would then seek regression work because the beauty, in my opinion, the beauty of regression work is that what is going to come forward in the regression is certainly not chosen by me, Linda, the therapist. It's chosen by the spiritual guides of my client who want to help the client unravel a complication that's going on in their life. And one of the clients that I'm thinking about is a woman, and obviously I'm cautious to take care of good, solid confidentiality, but is a woman who had sought various ways of both solving some pretty severe physiological problems as well as a very complicated relationship with a family member, and try as hard as she did over, I don't know, 10 years or however long it was, she couldn't, to use this word unravel, she couldn't unravel why did she still have the physical symptoms and what's the reason for the strong disconnect with this family member until we did a regression. And she learned through the regression that and that, for me, Lisa, I learn and learn and learn from client to client to client to client. So until we did a regression and we discovered an interplanetary past life with the soul of the person in current life with whom she has the major disconnect. And it was like, oh my goodness, this is a concept that needs to be understood. So, and listeners, you all can tell Lisa and I are working hard to make this as, maybe it's clear as mud, or hopefully it's clearer than mud, because this was like an aha that had never occurred for this particular person.
Yeah, well, clear as watered down mud. Let's say that we put a lot of water in there, and you can kind of see through it. So then let's talk about interplanetary siblings. What are families like in the interplanetary realms? Is it similar to what we have here on Earth?
The easy but complicated answer to that is it depends on where you come from as a soul. So let's just say we've got three interplanetary locations. We've got Planet X, Star System Y, and Planet Z. And on Planet X, the souls there have families. But on Star System Y and Planet Z, the souls in those locations don't have families as we know it on Earth. The families might be of a different nature because there may not be, the way that we, if you will, propagate souls. All, and here's where it's complicated. Often, each time I work with maybe not each time, but oftentimes when I work with an interplanetary soul client, we learn the nature of the home location of that client. And we learn, how do they nourish themselves? Are they primarily left-brained? Are they primarily right-brained? Do they have romantic partners? Do they have children? Blah, 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 blah. So it really varies in the case of the client I referred to a few minutes ago, that client came from a location, and I'm thinking so that I remember the details. That client came from a location in the higher realm where they did have families, and the soul with whom the client has complications in earth life was a part of the family in the interplanetary location.
All right. Wow. So many questions. All right. So let's continue this scenario that I have a sister and we're both interplanetary souls and we were both related in whatever way in this interplanetary family. Do you think that we would both have incarnated into human earth-based physical form for a specific reason to work out that karma? Is there some way that being on earth adds, I don't know, maybe a dimension to healing processes? Why would we come to earth, I guess, to fix this?
That is a great question. I think there's a couple of reasons. And so obviously, these two souls agreed to come to Earth. These two souls are interplanetary. That means, like I referred to earlier, these are evolved souls, these are souls of great wisdom, and Earth needed their wisdom. And along with that, these two souls had this is actually what's occurring to me. And sometimes, even Lisa, as I talk, I can hear my guides talking to me in my head. These two souls came to Earth not just to bring their wisdom. And I would say, yes, they came to Earth to hopefully intend to heal their karma. Now, on Earth, when we embody on Earth, we have free will. So we can go against a plan. But what I'm hearing in my head, if I can share this with the listeners, is that if these two souls move forward, which I can just say they, based on my knowledge of working with this one client, they have not cleaned up or balanced their karma as yet. But let's just say they do move forward, especially because one of these two souls now understands a bit more of the foundation of what's going on. I'm going to think in the glass half full perspective. Let's say they do clean up their karma, then they're going to demonstrate to anyone who knows them well enough that they have done this and they have cleaned up their karma. And that is, you might say, educational or inspirational or provocative for people around them.
Along those same lines, let's say that an interplanetary soul incarnates into a family of Earth-based souls, and maybe they're the only or a rare interplanetary soul in this family system. And is it possible that that can happen because the interplanetary soul has a different perspective, a different overall view of this dysfunction that this family really needs to work out, and they really need some sort of external perspective because it's almost too big for them? Does that ever happen?
That actually, based on my experience with clients, absolutely, that happens more often than not. In other words, it's intended. That interplanetary soul comes into, we might say, an Earth-based family, and the intention is what you just said, is the wisdom of that interplanetary soul. And, the wisdom, we could call that the patience. Like, wisdom can be translated into patience to support and help work with the other members of the family to, you might say, clean up their karma. So that's fairly common in my experience.
All right. So then, from the perspective of the Earth-based family members who have this thing that they just can't seem to get through, and you've got this sort of odd sibling who's just a little different from everybody else, and how can an Earth-based person if they recognize or think that they're recognizing this kind of scenario, how can they work with who they believe to be their interplanetary based sibling, relative, whoever it is, however they're showing up? How can the earth-based souls interact more? I hope you get what I'm asking here, because I'm not quite sure how to word it.
Yeah, what that brings to mind, Lisa, is that my background is conventional psychology. I'm a licensed psychologist and once was practicing as a conventional psychologist in private practice. So in regard to what you're asking, years ago, if I had looked at the scenario, or if I'd looked at the family, let's just say I was doing family work with the family that you're theorizing about, I probably would have scratched my head a bit and said, "Oh, there's a lot of this probably won't surprise people, but it's like a little bit of a not exactly judgmental perspective, but being trained in abnormal psychology, I might have pathologized, if you will. I might have looked at this family and said, well, oh my gosh, look at all this dysfunction." But the flip side is that, okay, you're listening and you're fairly sure you're an earth-based soul. And maybe in a minute I need to say a little bit more about that, but just to keep going with my thought. You're listening, you're fairly sure you're an earth-based soul, but you have a family member. And let's just stretch it and say you have a friend. It could be a friend, not just a family member, that you think is a little bit odd. Now, what do I mean by odd? Odd means they have a very narrow diet because they have a lot of allergies. Odd because they have 3 different colors of dye in their hair, or whatever. They're kind of, as we might say, smart as a whip. They're incredibly intelligent, but they're a little bit unusual. You probably know, it's always hard to put my finger on this, but you could well be talking about an interplanetary soul. Do your best to accept who they are. Do your best to see past the unusual combinations of clothing, the narrow diet, or whatever it might be, and honor them for their wisdom, because they came to Earth and they came into your life or your family or your friends, circle of friends, for a reason.
Yeah, you know what? You mentioned that you might want to talk a bit about earth-based souls. And I think that's probably a good idea, because I'm concerned that some people might be listening to this and thinking that maybe we're sounding judgmental against earth-based souls. Like, interplanetary souls are so wise and so smart. But that doesn't mean that interplanetary souls are better in any ways, because earth-based souls have a lot of strengths and gifts as well.
Right. And that's so easy for me to talk about because I'm an earth-based soul. So here's the distinction that I think will give clarity for people. If you're an earth-based soul, and all that means is primarily your soul was designed to incarnate in the human body. If you're an earth-based soul, and I'm going to pose a question and answer my own question. How does an earth-based soul grow and evolve? How does an earth-based soul gain wisdom? Easy to answer. Lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, sort of ad nauseum on Earth. So an earth-based soul primarily goes to school in the human body, comes to Earth, comes into this suit to learn through hundreds, if not 1,000 or more lives in order to evolve to higher level. But an interplanetary soul primarily, and everybody please just think about primarily, an earth-based or interplanetary soul grows and evolves primarily at their home base. And if they come to Earth, they're already, let's just say, a 7 or an 8 on a scale of 10 of evolution. So that's the distinction. And for those listening who think you're an earth-based soul, as am I, for the most part, you operate fairly easily in the human suit, as opposed to an interplanetary soul does not often operate easily in the human suit.
So now getting back to, again, the inherited physical stuff that human beings, even an interplanetary soul inside a human body, there are things that are inherited. Is it easier for an interplanetary? So, I mean, I know that it's difficult being in the skin, but is it easier for them to process perhaps trauma, PTSD, that type of thing, as opposed to physical illness than it would be for an Earth-based soul? Or is there no difference?
No, I think that's a great question. And the answer is it's usually harder for an interplanetary soul to process physiological and emotional trauma on Earth because they're not used to functioning on Earth. Whereas for an Earth-based soul, I mean, is it easy to process trauma? It's probably never easy to process trauma, but it's easier for an Earth-based, or what I call an EB soul.
So then, how can we release the trauma, whether we're interplanetary or Earth-based? How can we release the trauma of ancestral threads from interplanetary past lives, which are leading to our current life?
Yes, and people ask me all the time, how do we release past life trauma? And it's a left brain, right brain thing. And what I mean by that is when the person who, let me make it simple first. When any of us discover past life trauma, we grasp it from a left brain perspective. And in my opinion, primarily only until we grasp it from a left brain perspective do we know what we need to release. And then we have to do the emotional work. Then we start working on the emotional release. But if we don't know what we need to release and, from whence it came, so to speak, how do we know what we're dealing with? So it has to be, I use my hands like this, it has to be left brain and right brain both in order to let go of it.
Okay. So I guess to sort of wrap up this big ball of mud, if people are watching this and wondering, okay, I kind of get this, I'm beginning to understand what you're talking about, what do I do with all of this? I mean, I know you mentioned that doing regression therapy can be helpful, whether it's ancestral trauma or interplanetary past lives, etc. Where does somebody actually begin to move forward after listening to you and I having this conversation? Where can people take this?
Having this kind of clear mud conversation. Okay. To go back to something I said just a while ago, first thing to think about, people, if you will, listeners, if you will, is, do you think you're an interplanetary soul, or do you think you know someone who's an interplanetary soul, obviously in body on Earth? So that's the first step. And then, some people are going to say, well, I don't know if I want to have a regression. I don't know how to find someone to do that, blah, blah, blah. To step back maybe 2 steps. And I used to say to myself years ago, well, I'm not intuitive. I thought that years ago. We are all intuitive. And I would hazard to say that anyone who chooses to listen to this summit is not a young soul, or you wouldn't be interested in these topics. That's my guess. Secondly, I'm going to say this not exactly out on a limb, but you are intuitive. Trust your intuition. And I'll just put it this way, if your gut says, I'm thinking about my. I'm trying to come up with a really good example. Yeah, I'm thinking about my niece, and she's a really complicated person. And sometimes I have a hard time understanding her, but there's something that pulls me to her. And I'm just giving an example. I think I'm interplanetary. Trust your intuition. Spend your spiritual practice time trying to understand, well, what might explain this disconnect with this person? And so it doesn't require regression. That's just one way. There are many ways, but trust your intuition, because so often we don't. We think our intuition isn't accurate, and that's usually not the case. Your intuition can give you a lot of clues. Trust your dreams. Trust what comes up in a massage session. Trust what comes up in an acupuncture session, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or seek out regression work.
That offers so many different ways to go about this. Thank you so much for that, Linda. I want to make sure that if anybody does want to pursue regression work, Linda's website is ravenheartcenter.com, and you do regression work over Zoom or over the phone. I know you do distant work. That's for sure.
I do distant work, and since COVID, I do a lot of distant work, and I use Zoom, and it works just really well. So yes.
Perfect. Well, we're running low on time, which is a shame because I feel like we're just scratching the surface on this topic. Is there anything that you can think of that we didn't talk about? I mean, I'm sure there's plenty, but is there anything that you want to make sure that we talk about before we go?
Yeah, maybe I would just toss into the mix a much simpler topic, which is just the whole notion of past lives, and say to people, trust you've had past lives. They might be primarily on Earth. Actually, then what's popping into my mind, so my guides must be putting it there. If you're fairly sure you're an Earth-based soul like me, that doesn't necessarily mean you have not had a small number of interplanetary past lives, because most of us, like myself, we have had a small number of interplanetary lives. So don't negate that, and because especially if you're curious about what goes on with souls that are interplanetary.
Right. Wow. Again, just scratching the surface. I wish we could go on even further and even deeper. I want to thank you so much for being with us, Linda. I don't want to sound, like I'm just saying this. I really enjoy our conversations because, I mean, I can feel my brain just going, what? But I feel a little more expanded after our conversation. So thank you so much, Linda. This has really been a lot of fun.
Lisa, you are so welcome. It is my honor and pleasure to just share what I learn as I work with people. So it's been great to be with you again.
I want to remind everyone that I've been talking with Dr. Linda Backman, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation in the Ancestral Healing Summit.